Now, from Molly Ticehurst to Hannah Clark, the horror deaths of women have galvanised the nation and put a spotlight on domestic violence. Former ABC host Josh Szeps, who's got a podcast now called Uncomfortable Conversations, has been in the news today. He was on Ben Fordham this morning. He's been in the news because of an episode he did called The Problem with the Conversation About Male Violence. Here's a snippet.
Yes, let's try to pursue whatever policies make sense in order to reduce violence. But in order to do so, presumably we want the largest cohort of males to be on board with this mission, not feeling alienated because they're being accused of doing things that they haven't done. Now,
and Josh Szeps joins me in studio now. Josh, thank you so much for your time.
Great to be back, Sharri.
So, why has this episode been so controversial, do you think? I mean, you basically are saying that at the moment the conversation that we're having is overly blaming men for the problem when really it's just a few.
Well, I mean, let's be clear. The men who deserve the blame, and violent men need to be shunned by all of us, and domestic violence is tragic whenever it happens, and we should do everything that we can to try to help people who are in relationships with bullies exit those relationships. The reason why I do Uncomfortable Conversations, the podcast, is when I can notice an important issue that I care deeply about being cleaved into two kind of phony binaries. And in this case, there seems to be a perspective of either men don't care and men are part of the problem, or we have to agree that men need to do more, men need to step up, men are killing women at horrifying rates. So I just wanted to break down the data of what those rates actually are, see how we're doing, in the interest of trying to help create a conversation where young women don't necessarily feel more afraid of walking down the street than they need to, and where the largest cohort of men as possible can be included in the conversation, can try to understand why some men are violent and most aren't. And the way, I mean, just this happens so often with these kinds of issues, as you know, Sharri, whether it's about race or about feminism or about transgender or something like that, people hunker down into these kind of rival teams. And all I'm trying to do is occupy, I suppose, the radical centre or the sensible middle and say, hang on, let's just cool it a little bit.
The centre's only radical if you come from the ABC, by the way.
Well, I mean, I think there's a space and there's actually a hunger. And one of the reasons for the gratifying success of the podcast so far is that people are thirsty for people who can talk about controversial issues without constantly worrying about treading on eggshells or what tripwires they may trigger with their allies or how well they can signal their own virtue to people who are on supposedly the right side of history. I'm about having fair income conversations, so I put out this episode of the podcast. I didn't know it was going to do so well, and I didn't know that it was going to cause the conversations that it's caused. But on the one hand, I'll have responses from, as many women as men saying, thank you for talking sense and thank you for trying to bring a spotlight to what is actually going on instead of engaging in hyperbole on one side or the other. And then I also have the predictable backlash where I get a lot of feedback from very angry people who are missing the point completely and saying, you don't get it. Men need to do better. Men are killing women. I'd feel safer. They were holding up signs saying I'd feel safer with a bear than I would with a man. And this kind of rhetoric, I mean, if what you're trying to do is understand a violent cohort, then think about what we've done with something like terrorism, for example, where the extremism experts will say you want to sideline and exclude the people who are violent from the rest of their cohort. So you want to say to Muslims, for example, we're not blaming all of you for jihadism. We're trying to understand why jihadists are jihadists, and we want you to be on side in that fight. And I think there's a similar analogy that can be drawn with the case of violence against women. You want men to be on side, so what we should be saying is let's understand why there is violence in specifically domestic relationships. And by the way, that violence exists in lesbian relationships, it exists in same-sex gay relationships. There's something about the dynamic of being in an intimate relationship that can foster abusive and coercive control.
This year very clearly, the deaths of 28 women, and in many of the cases, it's a repeat offender. It's a partner or an ex-partner who the woman knew and had complained to authorities was threatening her or stalking her, and the person had been let out on bail. I mean, that's why he was free to commit the attack. So that's what we're seeing at the moment. But then this conversation is happening where all men need to take responsibility for this. So, what you're saying is it's not the case. Women, and in your piece, you say there are some women who are walking down the street just afraid of half the population.
Yeah, I don't think it's constructive. Like, I mean, so these repeat offenders and and I can honestly say, like, people say, you know, men need to push back better, men need to do more at standing up to the other men in their midst. I can safely say that the number of times that I've been sitting in a pub and with a bunch of mates, and one of them has admitted to abusive or coercive control over an intimate partner, let alone physical violence, is zero. And if that did happen, then everyone else would immediately jump on that person and say, mate, that is not on. So what is it exactly that I'm supposed to be doing about the other men in our midst, except for supporting policies that can identify those people earlier and target those people specifically rather than targeting all males? And I mean, I think we're also conflating here the problem of domestic control and domestic abuse with the supposed threat of women being killed randomly. Like, I mean, one reason why this has all come up at the moment is because last month was a terrible month for men killing women in Australia. But almost half of the women who were killed by men in Australia last month were in the Bondi stabbing. So, I mean, 5 of the 11 last month were in one very
attack.
Anomalous attack, right?
Yeah.
So
but
I don't want to foster an environment where
not
people
all
are...
men are blamed, but that you might still feel unsafe as a woman going
feel...
for a run by yourself.
You absolutely might.
I don't know many. Well, I wouldn't go for a run in a park by myself. You know,
So look, there are a few things going into that.
Somewhere where you're isolated.
There are a few things going into that.
Yeah.
Part of it might be the actual risk, and part of it might be that the way we're having the conversation about this stinks, and so you feel unduly concerned when actually the data. You know, I think it was about 118 women in the last financial year, which is where they keep the records, were killed. I mean, these are not... This is the third lowest...
Part of the reason I wouldn't go for a run, by the way, is that I don't run, but there you go.
This is the third lowest rate in 30 years. I mean, I just want some perspective here, right? I mean, men are killed at more than twice the rate of women in this country, admittedly by other men. But I mean, I sort of moderate my concern about being killed by another man on the basis of what the facts are, rather than on the basis of us constantly whipping up hysteria. I have the benefit of not living in a country that is constantly telling me that men are in danger, even though I am in more than twice as much danger as I would be if I was a woman of just randomly being killed by a man on the street. So part of our fear comes from reality, but part of it also comes from this drumbeat of relentless insistence.
I've got to go. We're out of time because Peter Dutton's reply speech ate into my show tonight.
Okay,
but I'm not blaming him.
Uncomfortable conversations is where people can hear more.
No, and I really enjoy your podcast. Thank you so much for joining me, Josh.
Thanks.